Today on RPG Horror Stories, we have two stories. One where players accuse another player for being too normal, and another where the DM doesn't allow any creativity at all. Opposite sides of the coin, both just as bad as one another. Without further ado, let's get started. Whenever I'm playing D&D, I'm usually the dungeon master, and that has been my role for quite a while. Recently, however, I felt a bit tired of DMing and wanted to experience being a player for a change, and it led to this story. While looking for a group to play with online, I stumbled upon a very interesting campaign idea. It was well thought out, and the world seemed to be very rich. I applied to the game and ended up getting to the interview phase and eventually accepted into the campaign. They were looking for 2 new players to add to their already formed group, but that didn't seem like a problem for me at the moment. Regardless, the DM asked us to create a character we wanted to play, and we would have a session 0 after 3 days. The time slot was good for me, and so it wasn't a problem. As mentioned beforehand, I was a bit tired of being only the DM for a while and decided to take the things easy on myself. Instead of making a caster or someone with a very controversial backstory, I went with a simpler route. My character was a human fighter, simple I know, who used to be a guard in a small town in the countryside. I wrote an understandable backstory with friends, family, etc., but I didn't do anything like his family was killed or some sort of thing like that. He was just a normal guy who was laid off from his duty due to not being very good at it and decided to travel and experience new things. Well, session 0 came to be, and we had our cast. The DM, the rogue, the warlock, the wizard, the cleric, the ranger, who was also new to the game, and myself as Jasper. When we first got online, everyone seemed to be friendly and were quite nice. After a short time, the DM asked us to describe our characters, showing drawings if we had any, and explained our backstories. When I DM, I don't usually tell players to talk about their backstory. I allow the party to find bits of it through gameplay, but that's up to the DM's style, and I saw no alarm in it. So, people started to talk. After a few moments, I realized my normal guy was the only normal guy in the team, which is completely fine. People usually make their characters something special. When it got to my turn, I described my character, his backstory, and showed a drawing that I made of him. Yeah, I had time. When I drew my character, I made him the most plain-looking man you could ever think of. No, he wasn't dashing, his nose was crooked from a punch he took while he was a guard, and he was just a simpleton, down to his bones. Now, we were using webcams. This was a DM requirement, and I noticed some expressions on the players' faces, but didn't give 2 thoughts about it while I was talking. Once I finished, one of the players almost automatically said, "Isn't your character too normal? I mean, this is D&D." I was caught a bit off guard by the question, but I said, well, yes, that's just how I envision the character, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have any depth. The interaction left the mood of the group a little tense, but I was the last one, and we said our goodbyes. We started the campaign proper yesterday, and I was very excited to be playing. We got together and finally started. Our characters met on a mission to escort a merchant caravan and started to get close with each other. The interactions were all interesting, though most of them seemed to have some sort of sensual innuendo. I myself don't really do that kind of stuff while playing and would just laugh it off. After a combat encounter, we finally arrived at our destination town and our group went to a tavern. After some role-playing with one of the players, the warlock started to have his character make some advances onto my character. He made some suggestions that I won't transcribe here because I don't think that's allowed. As mentioned, I don't really do that stuff while in-game, and decided my character would not partake in any kind of romance. That apparently made this player quite angry, which warranted him to question, why is Jasper not accepting my invitations? I was honest and said I don't really feel comfortable with that kind of stuff. I am a heterosexual male, and I don't really feel comfortable playing another sexuality or gender for my PCs. Well, apparently that unleashed pandemonium. The other players, with the exception of the ranger, jumped in and started to almost yell at my character for ruining their experience. He wasn't special, he was just a normal guy, and they were playing D&D to be special. I honestly didn't know what to say, so I excused myself and left the game session. Later, the DM came to me and told me he thought it would be best if I left the table, as it seems the majority wasn't happy with my character. There was nothing to do at that point, it didn't work out, but to me, it was the first time I saw a group kick someone out because their character was a normal person. Well, I hope you had a laugh at it. I'm just writing it down so maybe I can understand what happened, but I'm still a bit confused by it all. Okay, now obviously there's a lot of things wrong here, but number one, there is nothing wrong with making just a normal guy. A lot of my party have pretty standard fare backstories. No one is really going out of their way to make a crazy epic backstory. Our bard was a carnival performer, our cleric was a roaming nomadic believer of a knowledge god, our fighter was a gladiator at some point. I mean, they're very simple backstories that don't need to go crazy. There's nothing wrong with a crazy backstory, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with a simple one either. In fact, one of my party's favorite NPCs that I've ever made is just a normal guy with a wife and a peaceful life back at home. He's just a guard captain named Roran. They love him. And I didn't expect that, but they explained that his simplicity and his just basicness, the fact that he was just a nice guy, made him very likable. So I actually think those characters can really work in a D&D campaign. But the greater point is this. Getting mad at someone because they're making a character that you don't like is usually pretty crappy. The guy made a character that he wanted to make, a character he was clearly enjoying, a character that he could clearly roleplay with, and they got mad at him because it wasn't the kind of tone they were looking for. That's never acceptable. Let the guy make his cool guard captain fighter. What's wrong with that? The greater issue is forced romance. Never, ever, ever okay. The guy was not okay with a romance, don't force it on him. Doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a player or a DM, doesn't matter, don't ever do that. Don't ever force someone into a romance. It is weird, it is uncomfortable, it's just straight up bad. Nothing really more to say there, it's a pretty simple premise. Alright, I think I've made that clear enough. Next story. Here's my encounter with some painfully tight railroading. I was invited to play D&D with a friend. I didn't know the DM, but my friend apparently played with them a few times. The first red flag was that the DM barely looked at the character sheets, and definitely didn't look at them long enough to read the character backstories. The second was that we weren't allowed to die without prior permission from the DM. I've heard this rule before and understand it, but I later found out what he really meant. I was playing a 3rd level wizard that loved research and was obsessed with cryptozoology, and was on this adventure for the chance to study both living monsters as well as their fresh corpses. We started in a big city tavern and were immediately given a quest to investigate strange happenings in the city sewers. It was a cliche start, but I wasn't bothered. My first thought was to prepare for the investigation, as there was no indication of urgency and I had some gold on me. Also, my character was the careful type that would always ask questions about the incidents before diving into the problem. Any attempt by any party member to do anything except go directly to the sewers was shot down by a direct no. For example, our fighter said, "I'm going to find a blacksmith," because he wanted to get some extra weapons before going down. The DM literally said, "Stay with the party." Once in the sewers, we were met with a series of encounters with sewer rats and low-level undead, etc. We came across a handful of clues that were essentially spoon-fed to us. At this point, my character was low on health and had only one level 1 spell slot left. I suggested that the party head back to the surface for a long rest and to research the clues a little. The clues were related to history, indicated by the history checks involved when we encountered them, so hitting up the library or something similar made sense. The whole party was quite worn down from the early encounters, and there were no story indication that we were on a time limit, so they agreed. The DM told us no, because he didn't want us to split the party or derail the plot? This made little sense to me because the entire party agreed on this course of action, and we intended to come back the next day. At this point, we wrote it off as impatience on the DM's part. At one point, a large number of undead spawned in a large pool of sewage. My character had an artifact that could cast a lightning bolt once per day that I found earlier in the session. I thought this was the time to use it. On my turn, I cast lightning bolt on the sewage, hoping that I could shock the whole pool. I wasn't sure what the result would be, but I was willing to try it as long as it seemed interesting. Instead of letting my character try, and even telling me he tried and it didn't work, which would have been fine, it was intentionally experimental, the DM just flatly told me I couldn't do that. After coming across this kind of thing several times and a few brief discussions on it, I discovered that we were basically allowed to do only listed spells and actions, and only in ways that would produce their published results, and any creativity outside of that wasn't allowed. It also became apparent that nothing the characters did actually mattered. Everything was going to happen exactly as the DM previously wrote it, no matter what. Not even defeat was on the table. Any suggestion by anyone to do anything but the quote-unquote obvious next step was met with annoyance by the DM and a prompt shutdown, even if it didn't make any sense for the characters to make those decisions. I played D&D because I love telling a story together with the party, and I love trying to find creative solutions to problems. This had none of that. There was minimal role-playing, not really any at all actually. It was nothing but encounter after encounter with some clues dropped in the process. The players weren't allowed to make any decisions aside from which attack to use and on which sewer rat. And the only thing we could do was pick from the list of actions on our character sheet. Not a drop of creative action was allowed. I didn't see the need for conflict, so I followed through with the session. Afterwards, I let the DM know that I was dropping out of the campaign because it wasn't my cup of tea. I didn't raise a stink about anything, it just wasn't fun for me, and that he could resolve my character's departure any way he would like. There was no role-playing, and the only plot so far was resolved in the first session. There was nothing to tie my character to the party or the rest of the game at that point. I was expecting him to be a little upset or ask why he didn't enjoy it, but his response blew me out of the water. He said I wasn't allowed to do that, because my character isn't allowed to die without his permission. I didn't say he had to die, I just gave you open permission to do whatever with the character. I responded by handing him my character sheet and saying, "Do what you want, I am dropping out of the campaign." After which point, he kept ranting at me in what essentially came down to, I wasn't allowed to drop without his permission, and something about commitment. The last part I understood, and I said so. I walked away, like I said, because there was no way I was going to force myself into months of weekly in-person sessions of just waiting my turn to say, I cast magic missile, etc. Okay, so this one's the complete opposite. The last party was a bunch of players who wanted a guy to be more quote-unquote creative, and this story is a DM who doesn't want anyone to be creative at all. This is possibly the craziest railroad I've ever seen. Look, I've covered railroading multiple times. I have a whole video on how to avoid railroading. I won't retread the same subjects here. Look, railroading is bad. D&D is about choice, and that choice is what makes the game good. Yes, there are some times where you need to direct the plot in a direction that takes the game in a fun area of what you have prepared, but usually it is a bad idea to just force your players down a specific route because it takes away the entire fun of the game. I've already said that multiple times. You guys probably already know that. Let's get to the crux of this story, in my opinion, being the DM not wanting the guy to leave. Look, if someone wants to drop your campaign, talk to them about it, but ultimately, if they've made their decision, they've made their decision. Let them drop the campaign. It is just bad form to try to force someone to play D&D. If they're not having fun, let them leave. That is the most important thing. Never force someone to play Dungeons & Dragons. Life is short, D&D is long. People don't have time to play in a campaign they're not enjoying. That was really, really bad on DM's part, aside from all the super crappy railroading. And I think that that is going to wrap it up for today. If you guys enjoyed this episode of RPG Horror Stories, then please do leave a like to let me know. If you want to see more episodes of this series, as well as my other series, I have a new podcast that just premiered. If you want to check that out, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern for more D&D content. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.